She wanted to trick me and thought she'd take everything. But she had no idea I was 10 steps ahead, and then. I've been working with cars my whole life, starting in my uncle's garage as a teenager, and over the years, I turned that passion into a steady career as a mechanic. After finishing tech school, I landed a solid job at a respected auto repair shop, spent years honing my skills, and eventually saved enough to buy my first home. A 3-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, nothing extravagant, but something I could be proud of. I had spent years scraping together every spare dollar, taking on side jobs after my regular shifts. Also, I could afford a place that was truly mine. I had just settled into the house when I met Laura, a woman who walked into my shop one day with a car that cost more than my entire yearly salary at the time. And from the very first moment, I should have realized we were from two completely different worlds. She was the kind of woman who looked like she belonged in a high-rise office, dressed in perfectly tailored suits, carrying handbags that probably cost as much as my mortgage payment. And from the moment she stepped into the shop, she acted as if her car deserved a higher level of attention than the other vehicles we serviced. She spoke with this air of superiority, explaining that her luxury car required special care, and though I found her a little pretentious, I couldn't deny that she was stunning. Long dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a confident way of carrying herself that made her impossible to ignore. I fixed her car, she seemed impressed, and before I knew it, we were talking outside the shop, laughing about something stupid, and somehow, by the end of that conversation, she had given me her number. At first, it felt like I had won some kind of lottery, like I had managed to land a woman completely out of my league, and every time I saw the way other guys looked at her, I told myself I was lucky to be with someone so put together. She had this effortless charm, the ability to navigate high-end social circles with ease, and in those early months, she made me feel like she genuinely appreciated me, constantly telling me how much she admired my work ethic, how refreshing it was to be with someone who wasn't obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder. She would visit me at the shop, bring me lunch when I had long shifts, sit with me while I worked on my project car, and for a while, it really seemed like we had something real. We got married 2 years later in a ceremony that was more extravagant than I would have ever planned for myself, largely funded by her father, Victor, a towering presence of a man who made his money in real estate and always carried himself like he was the most important person in any room. He was polite enough in the beginning, making a big show of how much he respected that I worked with my hands. But there was always this underlying sense that he didn't think I was good enough for his daughter. He agreed to co-sign the loan for our house, not because I needed his money, but because it gave me a lower interest rate. And at the time, I thought it was a generous gesture. Looking back now, I realize it was just his way of keeping a grip on everything, ensuring that he had some level of control over our future. For a while, things were fine, though the little cracks in our relationship started to show almost immediately after we got married. In the way she talked about our home as if it were temporary, like it was just a stepping stone to something bigger and better, and in the way she introduced me to her colleagues at work parties, never just calling me a mechanic, but instead referring to me as an automotive industry business owner, as if the reality of my job embarrassed her. She would brush it off whenever I asked about it, tell me it was just about perception, but over time, it became obvious that she was constantly trying to distance herself from the life we had, always hinting that we should be striving for more, always making comparisons between our home and the luxury condos her coworkers lived in. It wasn't just her words that changed, it was the way she looked at me, the way her expression would shift ever so slightly whenever I came home covered in grease from a long day at the shop, the way she stopped asking about the projects I was working on, the way she rolled her eyes whenever I brought up ideas for expanding my skills. I had been quietly taking business classes at the community college, trying to learn more about management, trying to build a future where I could own my own shop instead of working for someone else. But whenever I mentioned anything about long-term goals, she would dismiss it as wishful thinking. She would tell me that if I wanted real stability, I should be thinking about a completely different career, something that didn't involve playing around with cars. Then came the promotion, the moment everything shifted completely, The moment she started acting like she was living in an entirely different world from me. She was suddenly surrounded by executives, constantly talking about networking events, always bringing up this one coworker, Nathan, a name that started creeping into every conversation. A person she insisted was just a mentor helping her navigate her new role. She would come home later and later, always brushing off my questions with vague answers about urgent client meetings, and when I pointed out that she barely spent any time with me anymore, she made it seem like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one making problems out of nothing. Victor and her brother, Scott, started coming around more, making little comments about how I should be thinking about the next step, how Laura deserved a life that matched her new status. And when I pushed back, when I said I was happy with the work I did, they made it clear that they thought I was holding her back. It wasn't even subtle. Victor flat out told me one night over dinner that the house should be in Laura's name too, that as her father, he had a right to make sure she was protected. And when I refused, Scott jumped in, accusing me of being selfish for not wanting to share everything with my own wife. I tried to ignore the way she was changing, tried to tell myself that the distance between us was temporary, that work stress was making things worse, but then I started noticing things that I couldn't explain away. I saw her texting late at night, always keeping her phone face down, stepping into other rooms to take calls whenever I walked in. The credit card statements were filled with charges from high-end restaurants I had never been to. Always on nights, she had told me she was working late. Always receipts for two. I started checking small things. Her car wasn't parked at her office when she said she was working overtime. She had new clothes I had never seen before, expensive jewelry that hadn't been there a month ago. Then, one day, I found the receipt. A men's watch, the kind I would never wear, the kind I knew wasn't meant for me. I stood in the kitchen that night, holding the receipt in my hands, feeling the weight of everything that had been gnawing at me for months suddenly settle like a stone in my gut, making it impossible to deny what I had already known deep down but refused to fully accept. I had spent weeks trying to justify the late nights, the distant looks, the way she always seemed irritated whenever I asked the simplest questions about her schedule, but no excuse in the world could explain why my wife had purchased an expensive men's watch when my birthday was still months away and I had never once worn anything like that in my life. I knew exactly who it was for, and I knew that if I went upstairs at that very moment and confronted her, she would find some way to twist the situation, turning it around on me, making me feel ridiculous for even questioning her, because that was what she always did whenever she got caught in a lie. Instead of barging in and demanding answers, I forced myself to sit down at the kitchen table, spread out the pieces of evidence I had slowly been collecting, and stared at them until the full picture became so clear that it almost made me sick to my stomach. The credit card statements showed a pattern. The same restaurants on the same nights, always two meals, always expensive wine, and always places she had never once suggested we go to as a couple. Her car's GPS history, which I had accidentally discovered while fixing something on her dashboard weeks ago, revealed addresses that didn't belong to any office buildings or client meeting spots, but instead led directly to hotels downtown, the kind of places where no one would ask questions as long as you paid for discretion. The worst part wasn't even the evidence itself. It was the realization that she had stopped trying to hide it, that she was so confident in whatever fantasy she had built for herself that she genuinely believed I would never put the pieces together, that I was just some dumb mechanic too focused on grease stains and socket wrenches to ever suspect that the woman I had married was out there parading around with another man while I was working late to build something better for our future. She had been laughing behind my back for months, sitting in boardrooms telling people she had already moved on, pretending that our marriage was nothing more than an inconvenient technicality, and I had been so busy trying to be a supportive husband that I had completely missed the moment when she had decided I was nothing more than a stepping stone to something better. I thought about all the times I had defended her when my sister, Olivia, warned me that Laura looked at me like I was some kind of unfinished project, something to be molded and shaped until I fit into the version of life she had imagined for herself. I thought about the late nights I had spent working on my business school assignments, believing that I was putting in the effort to create a future we could both be proud of, while she was out drinking overpriced cocktails and whispering in the ear of a man who probably never had to work for anything a day in his life. The anger that surged through me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt before, not just because of the betrayal itself, but because of the sheer arrogance it took for her to believe she could do all of this right under my nose and still walk away with everything she wanted. Instead of confronting her that night, I did something I knew she would never see coming. I kept my mouth shut, pretended like I hadn't seen anything, and started planning my next move with a level of patience I didn't even know I was capable of. I reached out to a lawyer the very next morning, showed him everything I had gathered, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, I felt like I had some level of control over what was happening. He told me to keep acting normal, to let her believe she was winning, to let her think that I was still clueless, because the longer she thought she was in control, the easier it would be to completely dismantle whatever future she had been planning for herself. Over the next few weeks, I did exactly that. I smiled when she came home late, nodded along when she made excuses for why she smelled like cologne that didn't belong to me, acted completely uninterested whenever she casually mentioned Nathan in passing like he was nothing more than a helpful coworker instead of the man she had been sneaking around with behind my back. I played my role so well that she never even noticed when I started gathering even more evidence, when I started recording our conversations, when I started leaving small baited questions in casual discussions just to see how quickly she would contradict herself. The more confident she became, the sloppier she got, and by the time my lawyer had built a solid case, I had so much proof stacked against her that there wasn't a single angle she could use to manipulate her way out of it. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I overheard her on the phone one evening, laughing in that condescending way she always did whenever she talked about me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, and saying something that made my blood turn ice cold. She was talking about looking at houses, describing a neighborhood I knew damn well she would never be able to afford on her own, and the way she spoke about it made it clear that she wasn't just fantasizing. She was actively planning a future that didn't include me. The absolute audacity of it all was almost laughable, considering the house she currently lived in, the house she walked around in like it was some kind of temporary pit stop, was one I had paid for with my own damn hands. And yet here she was, discussing new furniture layouts and mortgage options like I was nothing more than a financial obstacle standing in her way. That was the moment I decided I was done pretending, done playing the role of the oblivious husband, done letting her father and her brother treat me like some kind of low-level worker who should just be grateful to exist in their orbit. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while Laura had been so focused on crafting her new life with Nathan, while Victor had been running his mouth about how I needed to sign over half the house for security, while Scott had been trying to intimidate me into handing over everything I worked for, I had been quietly making moves of my own. 6 months ago, while Laura was busy spending nights in expensive hotel rooms, I had finalized the purchase of the very auto shop I had been working at for the last 10 years, making me the sole owner of a business that was pulling in more money than her entire salary. I had refinanced the house, removed Victor's name from the loan without a single signature needed from Laura, and positioned myself in a way where, no matter what they thought they could take from me, I would still walk away with everything that actually mattered. They thought they had me backed into a corner, thought they could push me into a settlement where Laura got everything and I was left with nothing. But what they didn't realize was that the entire time they were planning my downfall, I was already 10 steps ahead. I wasn't just going to leave this marriage. I was going to make damn sure that when it was all over, Laura and everyone who had conspired with her would walk away knowing that they had lost everything they had tried to steal from me. I spent the next 2 weeks pretending that everything was normal, waking up every morning beside a woman who had already decided I was nothing more than an inconvenience, watching her move through our house like she was a guest waiting for better accommodations, and forcing myself to keep up the act long enough to make sure that when everything fell apart, it would be on my terms and not hers. Every night, she came home later than the one before, always with the same tired excuses about last-minute client meetings, urgent marketing deadlines, or company networking events that somehow never seemed to involve any of her female colleagues. Only the same select group of executives who thought their expensive suits and corporate titles made them untouchable. Every morning, she scrolled through her phone with a small, knowing smirk on her face, sending messages to someone she claimed was just a mentor, never once considering that the man she was lying to had already collected enough evidence to make sure she walked away from this marriage with nothing. Her father called me one afternoon while I was at the shop, his tone dripping with the same manufactured concern he always used whenever he was about to make some kind of demand that he expected me to follow without question, telling me that he had been looking into investment opportunities for Laura's future and that it would be in everyone's best interest if I signed over half the house to her immediately. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he thought I was too stupid to see what was happening, throwing in a few lines about how marriages sometimes don't work out and how Laura deserved to be protected no matter what, as if I was supposed to just nod along and pretend I didn't know that his daughter was already planning a life with another man. I let him talk, let him go on and on about responsibility and financial stability, let him believe that I was too intimidated to push back. And when he was finally finished with his long-winded lecture about securing my wife's future, I simply told him that I would think about it and hung up before he had the chance to say anything else. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I asked Laura if she wanted to go out for dinner, knowing full well that she would decline, knowing that she would make up some excuse about needing to stay late at the office, and waiting for the exact moment when she would check her phone after sending a message to Nathan. Right on cue, she hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing down at the screen before putting on the same fake smile she always used whenever she was about to lie, telling me that she had an important work dinner that she couldn't miss and promising that we could plan something for another night. I nodded, acted like I was disappointed but understanding, told her that I would just grab something on my way home from the shop, and then watched as she left the house wearing a dress that I had never seen before, looking more excited about a supposed business meeting than she had ever looked about spending time with me. Instead of heading to the shop, I drove straight to the restaurant listed on our most recent credit card statement, parking across the street and waiting long enough to see exactly what I already knew was happening, watching through the large glass windows as she walked in and immediately gravitated toward Nathan, leaning in close as he placed a possessive hand on the small of her back. The two of them laughing over drinks like they hadn't just spent the last 6 months treating me like an obstacle they couldn't wait to remove. I could have walked inside right then and there, could have thrown the receipt for the watch on the table and watched her scramble to explain herself, but that would have given her the chance to control the narrative, to turn the situation into another one of her carefully crafted performances where she played the victim and I was painted as the insecure husband who just couldn't handle the fact that she had a successful career. Instead, I took a picture through the windshield, capturing the exact moment she leaned in and kissed him, then drove home and made sure that every important document I owned was locked away where she couldn't reach them. 2 nights later, my lawyer filed for divorce, having already prepared every legal argument needed to ensure that when she was served, she wouldn't have a single advantage left to exploit. I went to bed knowing that within 24 hours, she would receive the paperwork at her office, knowing that she would open that envelope expecting some kind of negotiation, and knowing that when she realized just how much evidence I had gathered, she would finally understand that she had lost before the battle had even begun. The next afternoon, while I was in the middle of a high-end repair job at the shop, my phone started buzzing with non-stop calls, Laura's name flashing across the screen in rapid succession, each missed call followed by another frantic message demanding that I answer immediately. By the time I finally picked up, her voice was already shaking, though whether it was from anger or panic, I wasn't entirely sure. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, skipping over any pretense of confusion, her usual carefully measured tone cracking under the weight of genuine fear. "You sent me divorce papers at work? Are you serious right now?" I wiped my hands on a rag, took my time before answering, then leaned against the counter as I finally spoke, keeping my voice as calm as possible while I watched my employees move around the garage, knowing that from this moment on, I no longer owed her the courtesy of pretending. I figured you'd want to get them as soon as possible since you're already making plans for your new life with Nathan, I said, keeping my tone light, knowing that it would infuriate her more than outright yelling ever could. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a long, tense silence, and then the inevitable shift into deflection as she forced herself to regain control. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her usual confidence. This is insane, Derek. We need to talk about this in person. You can't just... I know everything, I interrupted, making sure that there was no room for her usual games, no space for her to manipulate the situation into something it wasn't. I know about the restaurants, the hotels, the credit card charges, the jewelry, and the fact that you've been telling everyone at work that we're already separated. I even know about the houses you and Nathan have been looking at, the ones you were planning to afford after getting rid of, what was it, deadweight. Silence. Long, drawn-out, suffocating silence. The kind that made it clear she wasn't just scrambling for an excuse. She was realizing, in real time, that she had severely underestimated me. You have no idea what you're doing, she finally said, though this time, there was no anger, no false bravado, just a quiet, simmering panic that told me exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time in a long time, I said, letting my voice drop into something cold and final, I know exactly what I'm doing. Then I hung up, wiped the last traces of grease from my hands, and got back to work, knowing that the real fight was just beginning, but also knowing, with absolute certainty, that I had already won. The silence in the house that evening felt different, heavier than usual, carrying the weight of everything Laura had just discovered. But instead of facing me directly, she stormed into our bedroom, slammed the door behind her, and started making frantic phone calls to the only people in her life who could still convince her that she had some kind of leverage. I sat in the living room, listening to the muffled sound of her voice as she spoke to her father, as she tried to explain to him that everything was slipping out of her control, as she begged him to fix a situation that neither of them had seen coming because they had been so convinced that I would always be the one on the losing end of their plans. I wasn't surprised when Victor showed up an hour later, his tires screeching against the pavement as he pulled into the driveway with a sense of entitlement that made it clear he still believed he could walk into my home and dictate the outcome of my life. I had barely opened the door before he pushed past me, ignoring the fact that he was a guest in my house, marching into the living room with the same self-importance that had always made him believe that money and power were enough to bend reality to his will. He threw a thick folder onto the coffee table, leaned forward with his hands on his knees, and gave me the same condescending look he had used on me during every family dinner where he had tried to make me feel like less of a man. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice firm, as if he expected me to waver the second he started talking. You don't want to go through with this, Derek. A messy divorce is only going to make things worse for you in the long run, especially when you realize that you're not walking away with as much as you think. I leaned back into the couch, crossed my arms over my chest, and stared at him for a long moment, letting him believe that I was actually considering his words, waiting just long enough for the tension in the room to shift before finally breaking the silence. You mean I'm not walking away with as much as you think? I corrected, my voice deliberately calm, knowing that the lack of emotion in my tone would unnerve him more than outright anger ever could. Because as far as I can tell, I'm walking away with exactly what's mine, and Laura is the one who's about to lose everything she thought she could take from me. Victor exhaled sharply through his nose, reaching for the folder he had dropped onto the table, flipping it open with an exaggerated motion before shoving a set of documents in my direction, his jaw tightening when I didn't immediately pick them up. I had my legal team draft a proposal, he said, tapping his finger against the papers like he was sealing some kind of unspoken deal. If you sign these, we can settle this like adults instead of dragging this through the courts. Laura keeps the house. You walk away with a reasonable financial settlement, and we avoid any unnecessary drama that could damage both of your reputations. I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I glanced at the papers, but didn't bother reaching for them. knowing exactly what they would say before even reading a single word. He wanted me to sign over the home I had paid for, the home that had my name on every mortgage payment, the home he had co-signed for years ago as a way to make himself feel like he had some level of control over my life. And the fact that he had the audacity to frame this as a fair settlement only confirmed what I had always suspected. He had never truly respected me, had never seen me as an equal, had always believed that I was temporary, just a phase in his daughter's life that she would eventually outgrow. I think we both know that's not happening, I said finally, watching the way his fingers curled against the armrest of the chair, the first real crack in his carefully composed demeanor. But since we're talking about financial settlements, why don't we go ahead and address the fact that your name isn't even on the mortgage anymore? Because I'm sure you'll be happy to know that I refinanced the house a couple of months ago, removed you as a co-signer, and made sure that no matter what happens in court, this place stays in my name. The shift in his expression was subtle but undeniable, a quick flicker of disbelief before his face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he realized that the leverage he thought he had was completely meaningless. He turned toward Laura, who had finally emerged from the bedroom, her arms crossed over her chest, her face pale with anger, and even though she had spent years perfecting the art of appearing unaffected, I could see the panic behind her eyes, could see the exact moment when she understood that for the first time in her life, her father wasn't going to be able to save her. "This is what you've been doing," she demanded, her voice shaking, stepping forward like she actually had the right to be outraged. "While I was out working, while I was out building a future for us, you were sneaking around behind my back, making financial decisions without me, and planning how to screw me over." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to remain calm, reminding myself that she would twist anything I said, that she would use my anger against me, that she would try to turn herself into the victim in a situation where she was the one who had spent months betraying me. "You weren't building a future for us, Laura," I said, my voice steady, watching as her jaw clenched at the sound of her own name, as if hearing it without any warmth behind it made her realize just how far gone I really was. "You were building a future for you and Nathan. And while you were busy lying to my face, I was making sure that when you finally got caught, you wouldn't have a single thing left to take from me." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, grabbing the folder and shoving it back into his briefcase with an irritated huff, clearly recognizing that there was nothing left to say, that there was no deal to be made, that I wasn't about to back down just because he had spent years convincing himself that I was weak enough to be intimidated into submission. He turned to Laura, his voice sharp, clipped, the kind of tone he only used when he was truly angry. And even though I had been waiting for this moment, even though I had spent weeks imagining what it would feel like to watch her own father realize just how much of a disaster she had created, I was still surprised by the sheer satisfaction that came from watching his disappointment settle into something closer to disgust. "You better hope your lawyer can fix this," he snapped, shaking his head as he grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, barely sparing me a glance as he made his way toward the door. "Because if you walk away from this marriage with nothing, that's on you." And with that, he left, slamming the door behind him, leaving Laura standing in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself like she had just been abandoned, like she was the one who had been betrayed, like she was the one who had been wronged. And for the first time since this entire nightmare had started, I felt nothing but absolute, unwavering relief. The morning of the court hearing, I stood in front of the mirror, buttoning up my clean shop uniform, the one with my name embroidered across the chest and my certifications stitched neatly onto the sleeve, knowing that every single detail of my appearance mattered today. My lawyer had told me to wear something that represented exactly who I was, something that would serve as a silent response to every insult Laura and her family had ever thrown my way, something that would make it impossible for them to paint me as anything less than the hard-working man I had always been. I had spent years being treated like I wasn't good enough, like I was some kind of embarrassment, like I was just a phase Laura had settled for before she found someone who actually fit into her world. But today, I wasn't walking into that courtroom as the man they had spent so long looking down on. I was walking in as the man who was about to take everything they thought they could steal from me. When I arrived at the courthouse, Laura was already there, sitting beside her father and her lawyer, dressed in an outfit so carefully put together that it was clear she wanted to appear as composed and professional as possible. But despite the mask of confidence she was trying to wear, I could see the nervous way she kept tapping her fingers against her knee. Her father leaned in every few minutes, whispering something to her, his expression dark, his movements tense, making it obvious that things weren't going according to whatever plan they had concocted to walk away from this without consequences. I took my seat without acknowledging either of them, folding my hands in my lap, waiting for the moment when they would realize just how little power they actually had over the outcome of this case. Laura's lawyer started with the same rehearsed speech I had been expecting, launching into a carefully crafted narrative about how she had spent years supporting my career, how she had played a crucial role in my professional success, how she had sacrificed opportunities of her own to help build a future for both of us. He spoke with the kind of confidence that made it clear he believed his own words, that he actually thought he was painting her as some kind of devoted wife who had been blindsided by my decision to file for divorce, that he truly believed they were going to walk away from this with everything they had demanded. He barely got 3 sentences into his argument before my lawyer calmly reached into his folder, pulled out a stack of documents, and slid them across the table with a slow, deliberate motion, waiting just long enough for the silence to settle before speaking. These are financial records for my client's business, including documentation of his purchase of the auto shop 6 months ago, he said, his voice steady, his expression unreadable, his posture completely relaxed as he leaned back in his chair. As you can see, the sale was finalized before my client discovered Mrs. Ellison's infidelity, meaning she had no involvement in the acquisition, no legal claim to the business, and no financial stake in its success. Additionally, these documents confirm that my client secured the purchase with his own personal savings and a business loan that was approved solely in his name, further disproving the claim that Mrs. Ellison contributed in any meaningful way to the company's growth. The moment the words left his mouth, Laura stiffened, her fingers tightening around the hem of her skirt, her shoulders locking in place as she realized that the argument she had built her entire case around had just been destroyed in less than a minute. Her lawyer flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing, his jaw clenching, his carefully practiced composure slipping just enough for me to know that he hadn't been expecting this, that he had walked into this hearing believing the same lie Laura had believed, that I was just a mechanic, that I was nothing more than some clueless blue-collar husband who would roll over the second they threw legal jargon and intimidation tactics in my face. Victor leaned forward, his expression growing darker by the second, his fingers tapping against the table in a rapid, impatient rhythm, his annoyance barely concealed as he whispered something to Laura under his breath. But she didn't respond, didn't acknowledge him, didn't move at all. She was still staring straight ahead, her face carefully blank, her breathing slow and controlled, the only visible sign of her unraveling the way her pulse flickered rapidly against the base of her throat. My lawyer took his time flipping through the rest of his papers, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. Furthermore, we have text message records, hotel receipts, and eyewitness accounts confirming that Mrs. Ellison engaged in an extramarital affair with one of her colleagues while still legally married to my client, he added, pulling out another set of documents and placing them on the table. Given that this state considers infidelity as a factor in divorce proceedings, we are requesting that any spousal support claims made by the opposing party be dismissed on the grounds that Mrs. Ellison violated the terms of the marriage contract. Laura's lawyer opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again, his expression shifting into something closer to frustration as he realized that there was no way to argue against the evidence in front of him. Victor let out an audible sigh, rubbing a hand over his face, shaking his head like he couldn't believe the sheer incompetence of the legal team he had hired, like he hadn't spent months assuring his daughter that she would come out of this unscathed. The judge barely took a moment to skim through the paperwork before nodding, adjusting his glasses, and shifting his attention to Laura, his expression neutral but firm, his tone devoid of sympathy as he finally spoke. Given the overwhelming evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and lack of legal contribution to the business or home in question, the court finds no grounds for Mrs. Ellison's request for asset division, he stated, his voice clear, unwavering, final. The house remains in Mr. Ellison's name. The business remains in Mr. Ellison's name, and spousal support will not be awarded beyond a temporary transitional period of 3 months, during which Mrs. Ellison is expected to secure independent living arrangements. Court is adjourned. For the first time since this entire nightmare had started, Laura had nothing left to say. She didn't look at me, didn't argue, didn't try to plead her case one last time. She just sat there, motionless, staring down at the table as if she was still trying to process the fact that she had lost everything she had been so certain she would walk away with. Victor stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath, already pulling out his phone, already trying to find a way to salvage whatever reputation he had left, already treating his own daughter like a business deal that had just gone sideways. I didn't say anything as I gathered my papers, didn't give Laura the satisfaction of acknowledging her one last time, didn't spare her father a single glance as I pushed back my chair and walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the bright afternoon light with a sense of relief so profound that it settled deep into my bones. I had spent months preparing for this moment, had spent sleepless nights planning every detail, had spent years being treated like I was worth nothing. But today, I had proven them all wrong. I hadn't just walked away from this marriage. I had walked away with everything they thought they could take from me. And for the first time in a long, long time, I finally felt free.